Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. If you are new here, hi, my name is Monica. I like to post anti-MLM, life, and some true crime content here on this channel. So if any of that interests you, make sure that you hit that subscribe button, like the video if you like it, and if you're looking to see more of me, I do always link all of my social media below. This video is, of course, based on research I've done, also just some opinions of mine, so I do always encourage everyone to do their own research because maybe there's something I didn't come across or maybe I missed something, and if I did, let me know in the comment section below. But because this is a true crime video, I do have to issue a warning. Warning, the following presentation is intended for mature audiences. It contains graphic descriptions of crime scenes, adult dialogue, and adult language. Viewer discretion is advised. Today, we will be discussing Gary Leon Ridgway, who is also known as the Green River Killer. He is a serial killer. And because he is a serial killer, he has also been known to be the second most prolific serial killer in the United States because of the amount of confirmed murders. The reason why I chose Gary Ridgway, aka the Green River Killer, is because I found out a while ago that he was not as active with his killings when he was in Amway between the years of 1992 to 1995. Now, he didn't stop completely, but it was just a decreased number, and it was because he was busy with Amway. So I found that interesting. I know that a lot of you have been waiting for this video for weeks now. Actually, I think it's been a month. So I'm bringing you this video today. Also, I will link my video about Amway. I did a full deep dive on Amway. I also have covered multiple different true crime cases that do also have a link to Amway. I did just want to say that Amway is probably, I've said this before, but is probably my most disliked MLM company because I feel as though they kind of pave the way for other MLM companies to be able to be a little sneaky and kind of find all the loopholes. But I also don't like the amount of government connections that they have, because I think that because they have friends in high places, if you've ever heard the last name DeVos, that's what I'm talking about. But because they have friends in high places, I do think that they've been able to get away with quite a number of things. But again, that video will be linked either in the cards or below, whatever I decide to do. Let's talk a little bit about Gary's upbringing, the beginning of his life, because I do like to go over the beginnings, basically, is what I'm trying to say. I do think that a lot of things that happen in a lot of these true crime cases when it comes to serial killers or just people that just snap one day, I do think that it does stem from somewhere. And a lot of times, if you look at a lot of serial killers or if you look at a lot of just true crime cases, a lot of them do come from either a really troubled childhood or an abusive childhood. So let's just get into Gary's story. Gary was born on February 18th, 1949 in Salt Lake City, Utah. His parents' names were Mary and Thomas Ridgway. He also had two brothers. Along with that, Thomas, who was Gary's father, was a bus driver, and he had a very big dislike for sex workers. He would talk about it a lot. He would talk to Gary about it, and he would also later talk to Gary about someone that he knew that would have sex with corpses, which, if you don't know what that's called, is called necrophilia. Gary had admitted in an interview, I actually watched it, if I can remember to link it, I will, but it was a very interesting interview with Mary Ellen O'Toole, and I actually read a book by her called Dangerous Instincts, and it was a great book to read. I think she's great, and she kind of helped in opening Gary up in some interviews, one of which she was able to get out of him that he was wetting the bed until he was about 13 years old, and his mother would just just make fun of him for it in front of his siblings, and she would make him take a bath, and she would make it a whole big spectacle that he's still wetting the bed. And the problem with this as well is she would put him in the bathtub. Now remember, he did this up until he was about 13 years old, okay? Keep that in mind. She would put him in the bath while wearing provocative clothing. She would wash him, and she had this whole thing about touching Gary's male parts while she was doing it. And Gary would end up telling Mary Ellen O'Toole in that one interview I just spoke about that he honestly thought this was normal. But because of this, he started having just this rage and this anger towards his mother, but at the same time he would have these sexual fantasies about his mother. But at one point it got to the point where he started fantasizing about killing his own mother. While Gary was in school, he was known to be dyslexic, and on top of that as well, he was also known to have a very low IQ level. It was in the low 80s, so I'm going to assume that he probably had a really hard time in school. And he was not, because if you look at serial killers like Ted Bundy, for example, he was not as smart as some of these other serial killers are. But as we see as the story progresses, even though he wasn't very book smart, he had very, very good instincts, which would help him in not being caught for so many years. But while he was in school, it has been said that at one point Gary had lured a 6-year-old boy into the woods, and he stabbed him. He stabbed him in the ribs, and it punctured the little boy's liver. The boy survived, but he would also later go on to say that there was a point in time where he actually drowned another boy, and the time period that he would say that this happened actually matched up with there were drownings during that time period. So it wasn't confirmed that it was him. He confessed to it, but again, there was no evidence. They couldn't prove that it was Gary. So either one, he made it up just to add to his victim count, or he did actually do that. But obviously he was never charged with it. Remember how I said that Gary had a low IQ and he was also dyslexic? Well, he was held back in school, and he did not graduate Tyee, I'm not sure if I'm saying that correctly, high school until 1969. Gary would go on to marry his 19-year-old girlfriend. Her name was Claudia Craig, and he would also decide to join the United States Navy. He was sent to Vietnam, and while he was sent there, he worked for a supply ship, and apparently he did see some kind of combat. Now, while he was in the military, he was very actively having sex with sex workers. Remember what I said about his father having this hatred for sex workers? I believe because of that, it was embedded in Gary's mind that they're just, I don't even know how to explain it. Just, they don't count as a human, I guess you can say, which is horrible to say because they do count as a human. However, while he was having sex with these sex workers, he was having unprotected sex, which in turn would work against him, and he would end up getting gonorrhea. He was very, very pissed off that he got gonorrhea, especially because it was from one of these sex workers. However, it did not stop his, I guess you can say, his drive to constantly have sex with sex workers. At the same time of him doing this, it has been reported that back home, Claudia was also having an affair with someone else, obviously, and this would in turn end their marriage in divorce. In 1971, Gary would be discharged from the Navy, and then in December of 1973, he would end up moving on very quickly and marrying his second wife, Marcia Winslow. Many of Gary's exes and wives, girlfriends, whatever, they would all say that he had this very large sexual appetite, I guess you can say. But he was also very into having sex outside, having sex in inappropriate places. It was even reported at one point that he would constantly want sex several times a day. So, of course, that's probably why he was so obsessed with sex workers, because he could have them at any point in time. At this point in time as well, Gary would work for Kenworth, and he would actually work there until he got arrested for all of the murders and the crimes, when they finally pieced everything together and they had evidence against Gary. A lot of his coworkers would always say that they never thought of anything like that. He was always a really nice guy. The only thing that was kind of very well known about him is, while he was married to his second wife, he actually started to become very religious, to the point where he would start reading the Bible all the time. He would start reading it out loud at work. He would start reading it a lot at home. It's been said that he even cried sometimes when he would be reading it. He even at one point was going door to door and trying to spread the word of the Bible and of God. And of course, he would have doors slammed in his face. And I'm pretty sure that probably made him really pissed off, which, I mean, you kind of have to understand your boundaries. Not everyone is going to want to hear you talk about the Bible, but he became very religious. However, even with being very religious, he was still having sex with sex workers. He was still doing that. And then in 1975, Marcia and Gary had actually given birth to their son, Matthew. There was a point in time where Gary actually used his son as a way to gain the trust of these sex workers that he would end up murdering. He would have a picture of his son in his wallet, and when he would open his wallet, he would have the picture there so that they could see it, and they would think that this guy is a family man. There's no way that he can possibly harm me, because of course we all know that line of work is, it is very dangerous. It is a very dangerous line of work. You don't know whose car you're getting into. You don't know if you're going to disappear. You don't know what's going to happen to you. But he would use that as a way to make them feel comfortable. On top of that as well, there were a few times where he actually had his son in the car when he picked up these women and ended up murdering them. Of course, he said that his son never saw a thing, but he used his son. It was said that he was a very good father and that he was a really good family man. He, at one point, because Marcia and Gary, they divorced, and he was upset that he had to pay all the child support, but everyone always said that he was a really great dad. He was a really great family guy. The one issue that Marcia had, Gary's second wife, when they were married, was Gary's mother, Mary. Remember how Mary was berating him in front of his siblings, and how she was touching his male parts when she really shouldn't have, because he was a teenager, while she was also wearing provocative clothing? Well, Mary had this very controlling attitude. She had this very she just constantly had to be controlled. And she had a really hard time with Gary's second wife, because she would constantly be telling them how to raise their son. She would constantly be telling them how to handle their finances. It was even said that she was still buying clothing for Gary. And because Gary had this infatuation with his mother, he never stood up for his wife to his own mother, which in turn, there's of course going to be a lot of tension that's created out of that. And Mary was just very controlling. Gary and Marcia would end up divorcing, just like I said before, and Marcia would get full custody of their son, Matthew. This was in 1980, and it was reported, Marcia did say that the reason why she was afraid of Gary was because he actually put her in a chokehold, and she ended up filing a restraining order because she was concerned for her life. Gary would also file a restraining order because he was afraid that she would hurt him as well, which, how? If you're the one that allegedly put her in a chokehold, it makes no sense. It makes no sense to me, but I mean, in 1988, he would actually go on to marry his third wife, and her name was Judith Lynch. Judith was a good influence on Gary. There was a point in time where when he was with her, he felt almost at peace with her. He felt very, very safe with her and very just very, very loved by her. When he met Judith, he had actually already started his killing spree. He had already, his victim count had already gotten up to 44 victims. And that was within a 5-year span. We are going to go into the victims and the murders and everything, but I did just want to kind of go over his beginning and his adulthood and everything of that nature. Judith would later go on to say that she believes that she did save a lot of lives because of the fact that Gary was just so comfortable and he just felt really safe with Judith. And I do think that she was a really good wife to him. So I do agree that she did save a lot of lives because during their marriage, he decreased his killings. I mean, there were a few reported murders, but at the same time, we don't know if there were more victims than what Gary had actually said, only because those were just the reported ones. So there could have been more. Let's move on to the murders because there were quite a number of victims of Gary. Some have not been recovered, others have been. We will go into all of that. But on July 15th of 1982, the first body was found. And this body was found by 2 teenage boys who were riding their bikes over the bridge that overlooked the Green River, and they saw a body, and they contacted police right away. When they took the body out and when they were able to finally identify who this woman was, it was 16-year-old Wendy Lee Caulfield. The cause of death was determined to be strangulation by the victim's own clothing. And it was said that she was a sex worker. And a lot of the women that were Gary's victims, most of them actually disappeared from the SeaTac strip. SeaTac stands for Seattle Tacoma, and this strip was very well known to have a lot of topless bars, a lot of cheap hotels, and it was basically just the mecca for sex workers. And everyone knew this strip. Now, when the body was discovered, no one thought anything of Wendy Lee's death or anything about her murder because they thought that this was just another sex worker who went missing, who just got in the wrong car and was just killed. They did not take a lot of these murders of sex workers very seriously, unfortunately, back in those days, because it was just they didn't take it seriously, which is so sad to me, because even if you don't agree with their line of work, you have to remember that this is someone's daughter, this is someone's mother, this is someone's sister, and they had lives. A lot of these women were doing this because they just wanted to provide for their family. And especially, I mean, Wendy Lee, she was a troubled teen, and her and her mother fell on hard times after her parents' divorce, and she started doing sex work so that she can have some kind of extra money. They were living very poorly, and I feel like nowadays there's still a stigma surrounding them, but at the end of the day, these are still human beings. These women were still human beings who lost their lives to the hand of this serial killer. On August 12th of 1982, the next body would be found. This body would be determined that it is 22-year-old Deborah Lynn Bonner, And the person who found her was actually an employee of a nearby slaughterhouse, and he just saw her floating through the river. She was last seen on July 25th of 1982, and she was also a sex worker. On top of that as well, she had been arrested twice within the previous 30 days for prostitution. So again, a lot of people just thought it was just another sex worker who got in the wrong car, was at the wrong place at the wrong time. But then on August 15th of 1982, a man who was actually going down the Green River, he was in his raft, he was just having a normal time on the river, he would discover 2 more bodies. Those 2 bodies would be determined to be 31-year-old Marsha Chapman, who was a mother of 3, and she was also a known sex worker. She was doing this to be able to put food on the table and to provide for her children. And the other victim would be known to be 17-year-old Cynthia Hines, who was also a sex worker. She was last seen by her pimp getting into a black Jeep and was never seen again. Hey everyone, Editing Monica here. So my camera has been cutting in and out the entire video, and at this point, before we get to the next clip, there was a portion that it completely cut out, and what I was saying was after this victim was found, Dave Reichert was actually the first person that would be on this investigation, and he had come to the Green River, and when he came to the Green River, he actually stumbled upon a 3rd body. So that part got cut out of here. Let's get back to the video. This 3rd body that Dave Reichert would stumble upon would be that of 16-year-old Opal Mills. It would be determined later on that all 3 women were murdered by strangulation. They were also able to recover semen from 2 of the bodies, and they would keep this on file and everything like that, because unfortunately at this point in time, remember this is the 80s, and unfortunately the technology when it came to DNA testing was just not up to par. It just was not the same as it is today, obviously. After all of these women had been discovered, investigators deemed this to be an actual serial killer. This is when they started to take these cases a little bit more seriously, because a lot of the women were sex workers. All of them were murdered the same way, by strangulation. So they would end up deciding to form a task force, which would be called the Green River Task Force. Between August of 1982 and March of 1984, the Green River Task Force they just kept hitting a dead end. It was just, they just could not keep up with this serial killer. And they were just constantly finding bodies all the time. There was a new body that was showing up. All of the victims and the bodies that were just constantly showing up were that of mostly sex workers, with the exception of some runaways who they had believed that were just hitchhiking, trying to get a ride somewhere, and had just run away from home. The problem with these victims is because of the line of work that they did, this was illegal. A lot of times they wouldn't be reported missing because their friends, who were also, I guess you can say their co-workers in a sense, wouldn't report them missing, because what are you supposed to tell law enforcement? That she disappeared off of the strip. And okay, ma'am, how do you know that? You know what I mean? And a lot of their pimps they wouldn't go to the police because, of course, they would get in trouble. All of these people would get in trouble. They would get charged. So a lot of times these women were not reported missing. And then once they were found, that's when people would know that this woman has been missing for so many days and she was actually murdered. So that was the problem with that. In 1982, 6 more bodies were found. And then by May of 1982, Gary had actually been arrested for the first time for soliciting prostitutes, but he was let go. Not a big deal. His coworkers did find out about this, and of course there were whispers about it because Gary's such a big religious man, but he's still going and having sex with sex workers. So there was that whole situation. In November of 1982, there was also another situation. There was a 20-year-old woman named Rebecca Gard who she came in contact with Gary, and fortunately for her, she was able to get away from him. She was waiting for her bus. She had gotten off of work late. It was raining, and she decided that she was going to hitchhike home. Well, just so happened that Gary was the one that was going to try to pick her up. So she had a proposition for him because she wanted to get substances and she also wanted to get a free ride. So she said, if you offer me $20, it'll be in exchange for a sex act. And I'm actually going to read from this article that I found. So it says that Gard asked to see his identification, and Ridgway pulled out his wallet and displayed an identification card for Kenworth Trucking Company, where he worked painting trucks. Seeing the ID settled her nerves. At least she knew who he was, Gard told herself. After she directed Ridgway to a nearby trailer park, he insisted that they leave the truck and go into the woods. Gard agreed. Not long after they entered the woods, Ridgway attacked her. Quote, all of a sudden, he starts grabbing me and we're rolling all over the place, she recalled. He tried covering my mouth and my nose, and I just kept trying to breathe. He smothered me on the ground. He was sitting on top of me. With his shorts around his ankles, Ridgway tried to strangle her like he strangled his other victims. Meanwhile, Gard's thoughts were racing. No, this is not my time. I want to grow up. I want to get married. I want to have babies, she recalled thinking. I was like, this guy is not going to kill me. I don't belong here. I'm in the wrong place at the wrong time. She pushed Ridgway against a tree, stunning him. She ran to a nearby mobile home. I'm pounding and pounding on the door, she recalled. When someone came to the door, though, Gard could barely speak. Only 3 words came out. Please help me. Because Gard was using drugs and engaged in prostitution, she says she chose not to go to the police right away. She waited until December 1984, more than 2 years after the attack, to tell King County officials what had happened. Even so, her story contributed to the overall picture that was forming of Ridgway as a suspect, according to Thomas Jensen, the lead detective of the Green River Task Force. So, of course, obviously, at the time, nothing had come of it because she was afraid to go to the police because of her current situation. But I am so happy that at least she was able to get away from Gary. By 1983, 14 more bodies were found, and then again, by 1984, they found another 14 bodies. As these murders just kept increasing and just more bodies kept on popping up, the problem was just like I said before, they couldn't even keep up with it because nobody was reported missing. So they didn't know that a woman was a victim until her body showed up somewhere, whether it be at the Green River or if it was at another dump site, because we'll get into that in a little bit. But because these murders kept increasing, the investigators started noticing changes. It's almost as if Gary had started changing the way that he was just murdering them, and the dump sites were different. Just like I just said, they were no longer strangled manually, but now they were starting to get strangled by belts, by ropes, ligatures. I know that Marie Malvar, which we'll go over this a little bit later, but Marie Malvar, she had a special place where her body was left. She wasn't left in any of the clusters or at any of the dumping sites, because to Gary, Marie was special because she fought back, and he actually has a scar on his arm from Marie trying to fight him back. She was trying to get out of the situation that she was in with Gary. So of course, police started to think that Gary was starting to mock them because they could not keep up with him. He was just killing at large. And a lot of the bodies, like I said before, they were left in clusters. and only the special victims that fought back would get their own special place. But anyone else who wasn't considered special to Gary was put in one of these clusters. In 1983, Gary actually became a suspect in the disappearance of 18-year-old Marie Malvar. She was working one night, and her boyfriend was actually watching her get into the truck, which was Gary's truck. And what ended up happening was he would follow cars whenever Marie was working, just to make sure that she was safe, just to make sure that she didn't get in the wrong car or be at the wrong place at the wrong time. Well, he was following the truck, and he started to notice that there was a struggle. He could see that there was something happening in the truck. So he was following Gary as much as he could, and then he lost him at a turn. Gary had turned and gone in the direction of the Green River, while unfortunately Marie's boyfriend just lost Gary. So Marie's boyfriend actually ended up going to the police and reported her missing because she never showed up again. The only problem with this situation is that he did not tell officials what her line of work was, because she was a sex worker. He didn't want to get Marie in trouble, just in case if she somehow showed up back home, and just so she wouldn't get in trouble. So I understand he was trying to protect her because he didn't know the actual danger that Marie was in. After he went to the police, obviously, police didn't really take it seriously, because it's, if he would have told the police officers that Marie was a sex worker, maybe they would have pieced the two puzzle pieces together and sent it off to the Green River Task Force, because that's what the Green River Task Force was specializing in. So what ended up happening after that was Marie's boyfriend went to her father and her brother. She told them what happened. Marie still hadn't shown up. So they got in the car and they just started driving around. They were looking for either Marie, or they were looking for the truck that he saw her get into. They couldn't find it anywhere until just so happens that by luck, they somehow ended up turning onto this residential street, and they saw the truck. There was a marking on the truck, which made it very easy to spot by, the make and model of the car, the color, but the fact that there was a spot on the truck was how her boyfriend, Marie's boyfriend, knew that this was the truck that picked her up. So Marie's boyfriend and her dad and her brother, they go to police again, and they tell them, we found the truck that picked up Marie. So, of course, police end up going over to Gary's home. Gary didn't seem nervous. He didn't seem alarmed. He had no idea what they were talking about. And the police decided that there's no way that he could have had anything to do with this disappearance. He doesn't know anything that we're talking about. He seems so calm and collected. He doesn't seem like he's hiding anything. And so they left. They left Gary's home, and Marie was still missing. With that being said, it actually took police officers a long time to hand off this particular disappearance of Marie Malvar to the Green River Task Force. And so 7 months later, in November of 1983, the King County Police interviewed Gary and about all of these murders, and of course he denied everything, but there's something to keep in mind for the next victim. Now, Gary, the police officers went to his home about Marie Malvar in May, and then again in May of 1983, another body was found. A number of days in May, before police officers had gone to Gary's home, on May 8th, 1983, another body was found who was 21-year-old Carol Ann Christensen. The way that her body was found was much different from all of the other bodies that they had found with the Green River killings, but they did add her to the list. This time around, she had been strangled differently. She had been strangled with a fishing line, and the position that her body was in was like a totem-like position. She had a paper bag over her head. There was fish, I believe it was trout, that was on her neck and also on her shoulder. There was a wine bottle that was balanced on her abdomen, and they found just a pile of sausage near her body. So there was talk that this was maybe allegedly a religious symbol, kind of like the Last Supper almost, but they could never figure out why this was so different from all of the other ones. So they did add that to the victim count for the Green River Killer. In November of 1983, 21-year-old Kim Nelson goes missing in Seattle. She was also a sex worker. Let me backtrack. The last victim was also a sex worker. But, okay, let's keep going. Kim Nelson, who was a sex worker, she was working with her friend that night, and her friend had seen her get into this car, or this truck. And she never saw her again, unfortunately. She had been missing for several days, and several days later, Kim's friend Paige was approached by a man in a truck, and he had actually asked her, "Where's your friend Kim?" He didn't use her name, but he described her, and he said, "Where's your friend?" Paige had a very odd vibe about this whole situation. She just had a bad gut feeling, and she didn't get in the car with him. Thankfully, she did not get in the car with him. So she ended up going to the police, and she was telling police, I think that he's the one who took my friend. Just the way that he talked, it was just the whole situation was very odd, and I really truly think that he was the one that took my friend. While she was talking to police about this and they were interviewing her, they came up with a composite sketch that was very eerily similar to that of Gary Ridgway. In 1984, Gary comes in to take a polygraph test, and guess what? He passes. I do believe that this is probably because he wasn't nervous about anything that he was doing. I think that he probably truly believed that what he was doing wasn't wrong. In 1984, another task force was actually set up to help with this investigation because bodies just kept on popping up left and right. During this time as well, we all know who Ted Bundy is. He was on death row at the time. He had sent letters to, do you remember Dave Riker at the beginning of the story, who was the first one on the investigation? Well, he had sent him letters and said, "I can help." Personally, I don't think it was actually to help to find the victims. I do believe that it was just because for Ted's own narcissistic traits, and I just really honestly think it was to make himself feel better about himself and to remind people that he's still here and that he's still this amazing, well-known serial killer, that I'm helping the police because they don't know how serial killers work. I honestly think that that's probably why he did it. It was just for his own gain. It wasn't to help the police or anything like that. But he ended up being a little bit of help to investigators. And this was their just last resort. They kept coming, they just kept hitting walls, and they could not find anything that would link anybody to these murders. So they just thought, might as well talk to Ted. I mean, maybe he has some kind of insight. And he did. Ted Bundy would go on to say that he thinks that the Green River Killer is going to start changing up a lot of things because he doesn't want to get caught. So he's going to try to plant evidence in different places. He's going to throw the police off or investigators off from all of these murders and all of these. He would just start to change a lot of things. Now, Ted Bundy knew the area because he also killed in the area that Gary Ridgway was now killing in as well. And he would actually say to investigators that when you find a body, leave it. Let it stay there for a little bit, because he believed that Gary Ridgway, I mean, they didn't know that it was Gary at the time, but he believed that the Green River Killer would come back and he would end up having sex with the victims and he would be engaging in necrophilia. So that's what Ted Bundy told investigators. Investigators actually took his, I guess you can say, advice, and it was another dead end. But Gary did admit that he did do this. So Ted Bundy was right in that aspect, but unfortunately, police officers, investigators, they just could not catch him in the act. Now we're in 1984. So this is when Gary was married to his third wife, Judith. We know that Judith was a positive influence on Gary. We know that he decreased his killings. Now, you have to remember that before, they were finding bodies left and right. But now, they had only found, in March of 1984, Cindy Ann Smith had disappeared. And then in October of 1986, Patricia Barsack disappears. So, but again, we don't know 100% if there were more victims. These are just the ones that they were able to link Gary back to. And that's what he was convicted of. Then the next victims were, there was one in 1987, one in 1990, and one in 1998. During all of his killing sprees, there were also 3 unidentified women who were obviously considered Jane Does. In 1987, the task force would obviously be changed and they would go in a different direction because unfortunately, again, they just kept hitting dead ends. They just couldn't catch a break. They couldn't catch the person. It just, it was almost as if, I honestly think that they were probably starting to lose hope that they just wouldn't be able to find these women and the families just would never be able to rest, which is the unfortunate part, is that some of these families, they were, they were still hoping that maybe, just maybe, their daughter, their mother, their sister, their best friend would come back home. Now, this new task force would, in 1987, they would end up calling Paige. Do you remember the friend of the girl who went to the police and they came up with a composite sketch of Gary? Well, they didn't know that it was of Gary at the time, but he had an eerily similar look to Gary. They ended up calling Paige again and they asked her to come down to the station. They showed her a bunch of pictures of men who had been arrested previously, men who were possibly suspects in this case, and she picked out Gary. She said, that's the guy that picked up my friend. That's the guy that came to try to pick me up. So because of this, they had enough to get a search warrant. And remember, again, I know I've said this multiple times, but DNA technology was not the same back in the 80s as it is now. So they were able to get this search warrant. They had thousands of items that they ended up logging into evidence. They took DNA from Gary, and unfortunately, because he didn't keep trophies, so they couldn't find anything at his home that would link him back to the murders. And of course, his DNA, it was, they couldn't find any connection. But they would leave all of this DNA on file, which is good that they did because that's how they were able to connect him later on. But anyway, let's keep going. By 1991, they were still coming to dead ends, and the task force had actually been dismantled, and they had ended up putting one detective on this case. At this point, the task force and law enforcement, they just spent too much money and time and effort on this case to not be able to find any leads. They had a bunch of anonymous tips, but they could never ever link a specific person back to these murders. So let's fast forward to 2001, when DNA technology became much better than it was in the 80s and the 90s. In August of 2001, after they did a lot of DNA testing, they were able to link Gary back to the Green River killings. What they ended up doing was they wanted to have a solid case against Gary so that he could not get out of this, so that he would be charged with all of these murders and that he would not be able to walk the streets again. So they ended up putting him under surveillance. He was arrested again for soliciting prostitution, just like he was many, many years before. But they let him go to kind of let him think that he's fine, no one's watching him, not a big deal. On November 30th of 2001, two detectives come to Gary's work, and they end up telling him that he is being arrested for, at the time, 4 murders. Gary's response to this was, oh, okay. Like it was no big deal. So I don't know if he thought he was getting out of it, because he actually ended up pleading not guilty, even with all of the evidence, all of the DNA evidence that linked him back to these murders. So he was charged with those 4. And on December 18th, like I said, he pled not guilty. 3 more victims would be added to this case because they were able to, with all of the testing that we can do, all of the technology that we have nowadays, they were able to collect more evidence off of these 3 victims. And they were these little tiny paint chips, which were linked back to Kenworth. And in case you didn't know, Gary Ridgway worked at Kenworth as a spray painter. And this particular paint would only come from that particular place. So they were able to also add 3 more victims to the charges that were against Gary. In March of 2003, when these 3 victims were added to the charges against Gary, he decided to plead not guilty. Yet again, even with all of the evidence, all of the DNA that they had against Gary. But him and his lawyers ended up just realizing that they have way too much evidence against Gary. There is no way that Gary is going to be able to plead not guilty and be considered innocent or found innocent. There was absolutely no way, and they all knew that. So what they ended up doing was there was a deal. There was a plea bargain, and this was that basically they agreed to, he would plead guilty if he was able to confess to more murders, and they wrote up this deal. They added to that deal that he would also not get the death penalty, because he would have gotten the death penalty. He would not get the death penalty if he was also able to help them find more of the bodies, because there had been bodies that were missing for over 20 years, and the families just could not rest. On November 5th of 2003, Gary pleads guilty to all 48 charges of aggravated first-degree murder. He would also later be charged with yet another murder, which would make his count go up to 49 victims that he was convicted of. However, it has been said, he has said multiple times in different interviews, the number has changed, but they know that there were way more than 49 victims. They knew that there were much more that he wasn't convicted of. He confessed to some other ones. But anyway, let's keep going. Gary Ridgway, the Green River Killer, was sentenced to 48 life sentences to be served consecutively with no possibility of parole. He was also given another 10 years for tampering with evidence for each of the 48 victims. There was, and I don't recommend watching this if you are an emotional person like myself, because I was bawling my eyes out when I was watching it, but there was a day where the families were able to address Gary, the families of the victims. He did not show any remorse for anybody. He didn't show any emotion. The only emotion that he showed was when 16-year-old Linda Rule, her father, went up to say what he wanted to say to Gary, and he was the only one who stated that his religion says to forgive, and that he was giving Gary his forgiveness. Gary ended up crying. Was this because of remorse? Was it because someone showed him some kind of mercy throughout this whole thing? Was it just because he finally realized, I'm going to die behind bars? I don't know. I don't know. I don't think we'll ever know. Along with all of these sentences, the judge also ordered Gary to pay $480,000 in restitutions to the families. And that meant that any profits that he got off of any book deals, any movies, any docu-series, anything like that, if there was any kind of income that he would get from that, and any of that money would have to go to the families in order to pay this restitution. Gary is still alive today. He is going to die behind bars, exactly where he deserves to die. And he is in Washington State Penitentiary. Before we end the video, I wanted to go over something else, because this is how they were able to recover some of the bodies. Not all of them, but some of them. Remember how in the beginning I talked about how there was an interview with Mary Ellen O'Toole, who wrote that book, the Dangerous Instincts book, which I highly recommend reading. It was a really good and easy read, at least it was for me. And anyway, so on July 18th of 2003, Mary Ellen had actually come in to interview Gary. Now the problem was that Gary, even though there was this plea deal that they had, he was not cooperating. He would send investigators to look for bodies, and they could never find any bodies. So they were wondering, okay, is he lying? Is he just mocking us yet again? You know, what is he doing? So they ended up asking Mary Ellen to come in. She is an FBI profiler. I think she is one of the most intelligent women when it comes to this type of stuff, honestly. But again, that's my opinion. So she ended up going and talking to Gary. She was able to get some information out of him. He would end up telling her that his victims were in clusters. Remember how I talked about that? They ended up calling these clusters. But he would also say that his special victims, they all deserved their own special place. So they wouldn't be dumped with these other victims. On July 30th of 2003, Patty Eakes, who was the she is now the former senior deputy prosecuting attorney for King County, she goes into a meeting with Gary, and she basically reiterates what the plea bargain, what the deal says. And she told him that if you do not cooperate with us, this is no longer on the table. You signed this saying that you're going to help us find bodies. We have not found any bodies. So either you're going to start cooperating, or we're going to take away this plea deal and you're going to go on death row. So at that point, Gary started cooperating. And in August of 2003, they were able to find remains on Highway 410. The remains that they found were of Pammy Avent. Pammy had been missing for 20 years. Can you imagine being the family and hoping that she would come back, and 20 years later having to mourn all over again because they were able to find her remains? I can't just believe that. Then they were also able to find April Buttram at the Lake Fenwick area. After April Buttram was found, these field trips continued. That's what they called them, because they would take Gary out to these spots and ask him, where is it? He would draw up diagrams or maps or whatever you want to call it, showing them where the bodies should be. And at one point, he had said that there was a woman that he put up against a fence that he murdered as well, but she wasn't on the list of victims. They never saw that there was another woman that was missing. But when they started to look into this a little bit further, they looked in the records with the medical examiner, and there was a woman by the last name of Yellow Robe, and her cause of death had been determined to be a drug overdose. And now they found out that it wasn't a drug overdose. She died at the hands of Gary Ridgway. Can you imagine being the parent of this woman and having investigators come to you and tell you that after you have already mourned her death, after you've already not necessarily moved on or come to terms, but basically just after you already mourned your daughter's death, investigators come back to you and tell you that she didn't die this way. She died because of Gary Ridgway, and now the parents have to completely relive everything, and they have to mourn their daughter again. And I cannot imagine that. I cannot imagine that. And honestly, my thoughts are just with all of the families and the victims, because this is just horrible. But anyway, they were finally on September 26th of 2003, they were finally able to discover and find the remains of Marie Malvar. They found her in her special place that Gary called it, and after over 20 years of being missing, investigators can finally tell the family that they found Marie, and that they can now have a funeral, they can have a memorial, and they can put Marie to rest. And they would continue to recover more bodies over the next several months. However, eventually they would have to shut it down, and the total number of people that they would be able to recover from these field trips that they would go on, like how that's what they called them, they were able to find 4 bodies. And one of those bodies was an unidentified woman. They were never, ever able to identify her. So someone out there might be waiting for their daughter, mother, sister, girlfriend, wife, whatever, to come home, and she's an unidentified victim of Gary Ridgway. And I've known about this case for a really long time, and I really don't have any final thoughts on it besides when I watch that day where the families were able to address Gary and his actions. That was, honestly, I don't recommend watching it if you're an emotional person. I know that I've already said that, but I bawled my eyes out because I can never imagine what it's like to be those family members. I will never be able to imagine that because, I mean, there were just so many victims and so many families that were affected by Gary, and he showed no remorse. These women meant nothing to him. And I just find that so evil and disgusting. And he deserves to be behind bars, and he deserves to die in prison. I know that sounds very, very harsh, but what he did is just so sad and disgusting. So before I end this video, I did want to, just like I have over the last few videos, I do want to take a moment to just take a moment of silence for the victims and their families, and the victims that were never found as well, because some were never found. And some victims, probably no one even knows that they died at the hands of Gary. So let's just take a moment to remember the victims. Okay, everyone, if you have watched up to here, thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you think in the comment section below. Have you heard of this case? What do you think of it? And I guess that's all that I have for you guys today. Thank you so much for watching. This is Monica reporting to you live from a highway. Bye.